Well, good afternoon, good evening. It's an honor to be here. It's really a special pleasure and to be asked to give this lecture because I knew Jane Powell Dwyer when I was a graduate student. She and Ned had studied in Berkeley with John Rowe, as did I, but they were a little bit older than I was, and so we all thought of ourselves as sort of a tribe or a panaca. They sometimes called the Roistas, and Jane and Ned to me just seemed so accomplished and sophisticated at that time. They were just like the coolest people. I was like, a graduate student who had achieved very little and had all sorts of worries, and they to me were what I wanted to aspire to. So I can still remember in 1973 when we were all together in Cusco in the summer on different projects, and we would go to the Hotel de Turistas in Cusco and have pisco sours, and it was really the first time I drank with any regularity. So it's in any case, so it's a great honor for me to have this. I thought today I would talk about research I've been doing very recently. I've rarely actually spoken about this, so it's fun for me to talk about it, which is the study of Vermilion or Cinnabar and what we can learn from it. Let's see. The way I got into it is going back to my work in Chavín when I was doing my thesis work. And this is what Chavín looks like when you're on a hill and looking down at it. And I excavated in a house that was located behind the temple, in part because I was committed to understanding the socioeconomic basis of Chavín, in part because I couldn't get a permit to work in the temple. So I was excavating a house, and I had been very impressed by the fact that there was so many exotic items at Chavín, just simply off the graph. There's probably no early site that has anything even close to the number of exotics that Chavín has, and I was trying to understand where they came from and why they were there, including pots like this one, which Lumbreras had identified as the Mosna style, named after a local river, but it turns out that it was actually in a style that's typical of the northern highlands of Cajamarca and wasn't local at all. And they were finding and continue to find Strombus shells like this one that come from the coast of Ecuador, where you have warmer waters, because a shell like this wouldn't actually survive in the cold waters of Peru. Interestingly enough, these shells are very often engraved in a style that's typical of the eastern slopes of the Andes, of the cloud forest. So it's almost a double exotic. It's exotic in its origin, it's exotic in the way it was transformed, and then it was cut and used as a trumpet. But these are things I didn't find. I didn't work in the temple, but I did find things like this, which are ear spools or ear ornaments that were made out of stone, polished stone. And one of them, the one over here, which was found on the floor of a house, had bright red pigment on it, really strikingly strong red pigment on it. And I said, well, this isn't the kind of pigment I'm used to seeing, which is usually hematite-based, sometimes called red ochre. This is something else, and I took it to a chemist at that time, and the chemist said, well, this is very high in mercury. This is Cinnabar. And so I began to think, oh, well, isn't that interesting? Cinnabar, where do you find Cinnabar? I mean, what is Cinnabar? Because I wasn't really all that familiar with it. And, Cinnabar is mercuric sulfide or mercury sulfide. It's an ore, and it can be mined, and with the proper techniques, mercury can be extracted from it, but in its natural state, it often has a very strong red color, and it can be ground up and you can separate out the impurities, and you end up with a very vivid pigment, which is sometimes referred to as vermilion. Cinnabar deposits are actually quite rare. And it turns out that Peru has the largest cinnabar deposit in the entire Western Hemisphere, in the entire New World. And it's located at Huancavelica. And even today, it's considered to be among the top 4 mercury deposits in the world, cinnabar deposits in the world. The largest, or best known one at least, is the one in Almaden, Spain, which was used from Greek times on. There's a second one in Slovenia, in Atalla, and then the one at Huancavelica is probably the third in terms of size. So, I mean, it's really massive, and it was used extensively during colonial times because it turns out that if you extract metallic mercury from the cinnabar, you can then use that metallic mercury, which is like what we have in or used to have in thermometers, or I used to play with as a child in games, that metallic mercury can be used in the amalgamation process. And the amalgamation process allows you to extract gold from relatively low-grade ores. And it's still being used today, and it's a major source of mercury pollution. It's a major health hazard. But this was only established during early colonial times in Mexico, and then the technique was adopted in Peru in early colonial times and used for another 250 years. But before that, before it was ever used for amalgamation, it was used for the red colorant. And it was observed by the Spaniards that there were actually mining tunnels that had been carved into the deposit before the Spanish began to work. And sometimes they would even find tools, pre-Hispanic tools, in these. Well, this went on for, the mining by the Spaniards went on for several centuries, and they ended up taking out more than 50,000 tons of mercury from that mine. But this is what cinnabar looks like, just to give you an idea. And this is vermilion color. This is a kind of pigment. When you pulverize it, depending on the grade to which you pulverize it, it changes the tone of red. But it's a kind of red that is very hard to confuse with other red colorants. Nick Saunders once wrote a couple of articles in which he observed that Native Americans in general love shimmering colors. They love color. They love visual effects in which the surface seems to glimmer or dazzle. And so that's why they love things like feathers, for example, or gold or silver. All of these things have certain optical qualities to them that are very special. And I would say that vermilion fits into this general category of something that is thought to be special because of the way in which light is reflected in it, in which the color then dazzles. Well, I then speculated, but this is going all the way back to the publication of my thesis, that it could be that the cinnabar that was found on this ear spool came all the way from Huancavelica. And Huancavelica is located several hundred kilometers away from Chavín de Huántar. Here's Chavín de Huántar, and Huancavelica is all the way down here somewhere. I can't really see the screen well, but hopefully you can. In any case, it was a long distance, and if in fact it was a trade item, it would be really add to our understanding of the movement of goods and also the development in the area surrounding Huancavelica. Now, this is a picture of what the mine looked like in colonial times. It was called Villarica at times because it was one of the richest cities in all of Peru. It's located close to the Puna, The highest part of it is over 4,000 meters. The lowest part's it's 3,600 meters. And it was so rich that they built 3 different cathedrals there. So it's absolutely spectacular. Here you can see Wamampoma, a native artist version of what it looked like with people carrying the Cinnabar down from the tunnels. And over here you can see the way in which they were extracting the mercury, the metallic mercury, from the cinnabar by heating it up and turning it into a gaseous state and then allowing it to solidify as a liquid, as metallic mercury, to condense as metallic mercury. Of course, when they did that, when they turned it into vapor, they were subjecting themselves to an enormous health risk. Okay. These are one of the cathedrals that you find today. You go to Huancavelica, and it seems like a very strange kind of place because it's a relatively small town. I mean, it's largely impoverished, but you have these tremendous cathedrals that are sitting there as sort of a testimony to the time when this was such an important place for the Spanish Empire. Virtually all of the silver in Potosí, Bolivia, was acquired by the amalgamation process using mercury taken from the mine in Huancavelica, the best known of which is the Santa Barbara mine. So they would ship the mercury down to Bolivia and then use it because the Potosí silver ores were relatively low grade. And I've been there, and you can still see the shaft that was used in colonial time, and they actually have a crest that's carved. The crest of the Spanish crown is still visible above the entrance to the tunnel into the mine, which is over here, but it's not there. The mine's, of course, closed. Well, I left it at that, as it was basically an educated speculation of what seemed to me a plausible possibility, but certainly I hadn't proven it. And I got involved in other projects, many other projects, one of which was obsidian. And I began to look for obsidian sources. And that brought me back to Huancavelica because I had the belief that that might be one area where there would be an obsidian deposit. And while I was there with Ramiro Matos, I realized that we were near a very important Chavín site that Ramiro had studied in the 1950s, a site called Atalla. And so we decided, this was right after the defeat of Sendero. Actually, there was still a state of siege while we were there. The place was just surrounded by troops, but we went anyway, foolishly looking back. And we got to Atalla, and sure enough, it was as he had described, a very large site with a terrace mound, cut stone walls, had a large central staircase, not unlike the one at Chavín de Huantar. It had large canals that also were reminiscent of Chavín sites. And at that time it occurred to me, oh, well, why is there this major Chavín site here far to the south of any of the other known Chavín sites? Out here in the middle of nowhere in an area that is agriculturally relatively poor, and which if you look at the prehistory prior to building Atalla, it was only small-scale groups with very tiny archaeological sites. What would have stimulated the creation of Atalla? And I suggested, based on looking at the artifacts at the site, which were very, very similar to Chavín de Huantar, this typical Chavín style or Canabariu style ceramics, that it was likely that Atalla had been built there in order to play some role in the Cinnabar trade. And that Roger Ravinas had earlier noted that there were some small sites, even closer to the mine, where he found an unusual number of grinding stones with red pigment, but he hadn't said what kind of pigment or why they were there. I said, well, these seem to have been perhaps workshops where they were preparing the pigment, and perhaps Atalla was a place where all of the cinnabar could have been collected, and where some sort of leadership would have entered into agreements and transported it into other distant centers, and in the process they would have emulated some of the more sophisticated centers that they had contact with. So that seemed like a really reasonable explanation of Atalla, but once again, I couldn't really even prove that the Huancavelica mine had been used in Chavín times, which is to say between 900 BC and 400 BC. I couldn't actually demonstrate that. But someone read our article, Colin Cook, who was a geophysicist or geochemist, and he became interested in this question, and he did a very interesting thing. He actually took cores from a series of lakes that were near Huancavelica. He took 2 cores from lakes near Huancavelica, and then 1 core that was taken from the sort of Apurimac area near where Vilcabamba is located, so at a much further distance. And it was called Laguna Yanacocha, or the Black Lake, and he did 2 of them. He called them LY1 and LY2, which you can see over here. And they're right near Huancavelica, while the other one was taken from Negria, was down here somewhere. I can't really see from here. But in any case. And what he found was, astonished me. What he was able to show was that in LY1, you could measure the amount of mercury in each of the layers. And because it was gradually accumulating, you could actually date each of the layers as well. And so you could come up with a lake core that had a calibrated radiocarbon chronology associated with it. And he was able to demonstrate over here that there's sort of a base level at which there's virtually no mercury. And then around 1300 or 1400 BC or 1500 BC, suddenly you get an increase in the amount of mercury. And then when you get to the height of Chavín, there's a spike. And then it continues at a fairly high level until you get to Inca times, in which it really takes off, and then colonial times, it goes through the roof. So basically what these lake cores did were serve as a proxy for the mining. And his explanation of it was that when you do the mining, you're bringing up all of this dust, and then the dust blows over the lake and is deposited in the lake. And the more mining you do, the more dust you generate, and therefore the higher readings you get. That can be contrasted with this situation in Negria, where there's basically very little of the mercury in early times. It's only when you get into Inca times that things really take off, because there some of the mercury is coming from smelting metals, and it's blowing all the way over to Cusco. So it's a very different situation. So in a way, I felt that this was confirming that, in fact, the Huancavelica source had been used. It had begun to be used at a low level before Chavín. It had been used at a high level during Chavín times, which was consistent with what I had suggested based on Atalla and the ear spool. But that wasn't the only possible choice. You could say, well, could it have come from somewhere else? At the same time I was writing, some other people were writing, including a classmate of Ned's from Berkeley, Karen Olson Bruns, who said, well, I think that the cinnabar is actually coming from a place called the Soges, which is up here. in Spanish, azogue means mercury, right? Quicksilver. And so the fact that it was called azogues to her was conclusive. I think that this had to be a major source of mercury. And there were colonial mining shafts in the area, and people had said that this was a source of mercury. And there were even some historic documents that seemed to mention mercury mining. And she noted that because she was working in Cuenca, which is the city in Ecuador closest to Azogues, that in fact a large amount of cinnabar had been found on artifacts excavated or looted from Batan Grande, which belongs to the Lambayeque or Sican culture from 900 AD to 1100 AD. And that in fact, Batan Grande is much closer to Azogues than it is to Huancavelica. It's actually twice as far to Huancavelica as it is to Azogues. So she suggested that mass like this, that were covered with cinnabar, probably were getting their cinnabar from Ecuador, from this site nearby. And all of a sudden, a bunch of other people said, well, that makes sense. And even people, serious people like Izumi Shimada and some other people in Peru began to pick this up. The idea of trade with Ecuador is an attractive one in pre-Columbian times. And we know they were getting spondylus shell and strombus shell, which of course come from the coast, but nonetheless, probably were moving through the highlands to get to Peru. And so this was an attractive idea. So in a sense, this offered an alternative to Huancavelica. Even if they were using, you could say, the cinnabar source in Huancavelica in Chavín times, or in later times, maybe part of the cinnabar was actually coming from Ecuador. Well, this bothered me and sort of nagged away at me because I thought I'd sort of proven this, or at least made a very an overwhelming case, but I realized they were right, that I hadn't gone far enough. And because I'd been working on the sourcing of obsidian, I knew that, with all the scientific techniques that are coming out, one should be able, hopefully, to determine where a specific kind of raw material comes from. For example, in the case of obsidian, I had shown that it mainly came from 8 different sources, and 12 different deposits had been found. There's some other really tertiary ones, but we were able to locate all of the major obsidian sources, and using neutron activation and X-ray fluorescence, we were able to reconstruct the changing patterns of exchange in Peru. And I said, why can't I do the same thing for cinnabar? Here's simply the plot of the obsidian. You can plot, different elements, and they'll form groups or signatures, clusters, and one source is easily distinguishable from the other. Of course, it's widely known that obsidian is the easiest material to do this with, and most other materials offer greater challenges. But just when I was thinking along these lines, I came into contact with the same person who'd published that article on the lake cores, Colin Cook. And he said, there's all sorts of things we could do together on mercury, and why don't I get a postdoc? He's a Canadian. Why don't I get a postdoc at Yale? And so in 2009, he came to Yale for a year and had a postdoc that was split between anthropology and geology and geophysics with some of my colleagues there. And he had begun working with Holger Hintelmann at Trent. And Holger Hintelmann had been able to show that if you look at the stable isotopes of mercury, of which there are many, you can actually see that each mercury deposit or each cinnabar deposit has a distinctive suite of isotopes that in part because when they're in the ground and when they react with the climate and the local geology, they take on a particular configuration. And this can be measured, and it can be used to distinguish one Cinnabar source from another. And he said, why don't we do this for archaeological materials? And Holger Hintelman, who's I think the only person in the world who does mercury isotopes, because the highly toxic nature of mercury makes most labs want to steer clear of it. But we were able to collect a whole series of source samples and then test them, and sure enough, we were able to separate one from the other using these mercury isotopes. Here are the mercury isotopes. And then we said, well, now the question is to get different archaeological samples in order to test them and see how they compare to the isotopic signature that we had determined for Huancavelica versus the other potential sources. And fortunately, I've been in the field long enough that I knew a lot of people who are willing to assist in this. And we are able to, for example, get from Ramiro Matos, who's now curator at the Museum of the American Indian, and they had a tomb, the tomb contents that had been looted in Chongoyape in the early 20th century. There's a gold Chavín crown from Chongoyape. And along with it, they had the cinnabar that had been buried with it, and they actually had different colors of cinnabar because depending on how it's pulverized, you get a different tone. And so we were able to get those to test. And I had a graduate student who was working at a site called Gramalote, which is near Huanchaco, the beach community near Trujillo on the north coast. And he had excavated a whole series of fishing houses, and he had found all sorts of pigments. And these pigments, when tested using a portable XRF, showed that they had mercury in them. And these were particularly interesting because they dated to this period before Chavín. And so they fit with the actual lake core that had been done. And some of this was on mortars, but others were actually on artifacts. For example, there were seals like this one that were used probably for painting of skin. And there was still red pigment on them for body painting. And then some of my Japanese colleagues helped me as well. Issei Tsurumi, who had been excavating at Las Huacas, and Hecatepeque had some cinnabar that came from a late initial period context, which would be like the earliest part of the Chavín sequence. And he gave me his sample. And then another colleague, Dr. Chivata, who'd been working at Cerro Blanco. This is Teo's reconstruction of Cerro Blanco in the National Museum, and no longer is there. But this is a photo of the actual archaeological site. It's a public site, but he found a series of offerings that included cinnabar, and one of which was a piece of pottery that was covered with this very bright pigment. Another set of friends, Yoshio Onuki and Kenyo, they were working at a major site in Northern Highlands that was related to Chavín, Kuntawasi, and they found a series of elite tombs along the main axis of the site on the summit with, once again, fabulous, gold and other items of elite status. And in the tombs, there were concentrations of cinnabar around the head of the individuals. And this actually occurred in the majority of the male burials of these elite individuals. And very recently at Pacopampa, Yuki Seki was excavated at a site in some ways quite similar to Kunturwasi, another Chavín site, but almost at the Ecuadorian border. And he found along the main axis of the site another of these elite burials, all dating to the first part of the first millennium BC. He had both colorants of azurite, but also cinnabar that you see here in gold. And he was able to give me samples. So I was really, in very, very good shape. And from our museum, we were able to look at some Paracas pottery. It turned out that the Paracas pottery, also in some cases, early Paracas pottery, was using cinnabar as a colorant. And then I said, well, why stop there? In later times, they continued to use cinnabar. So for example, the Dama de Cao, the Señora de Cao, the most elaborate burial, moche burial at the Huaca El Brujo, it was featured in National Geographic from early moche times. It turned out that her body was covered with cinnabar. So we got the excavator, Regulo Franco, to scrape off a bit of the cinnabar that was decorating her body. And we continued on to things that were Middle Horizon in date, such as these burial masks that also used red pigment and date to around 900 AD. And we were able to get the Metropolitan Museum to loan us some of the cinnabar from these gold masks that had been looted at Batan Grande. And we didn't stop there. There were these very interesting artifacts that are frequently shown in museum as being boating paraphernalia. They're often shown as oars. I personally don't believe they had anything to do with nautical enterprises. I think they were ceremonial digging boards that were used to turn over the earth when the planting season began, or to clean canals. They were agricultural tools, but agricultural tools in the same sense that a mayor has a chrome plated spade that he goes out and he turns over the first little bit to create a building or something like that. But these were covered also with pigment, or often used pigment. And when we radiocarbon dated them, we did, I think, 3 of them. They all dated to what is generally thought to be the period of Inca occupation of the south coast, which is what some people had suggested for their date in any case. And finally, we even took some pigment from keros, or these ceremonial drinking cups that were used in colonial times after the Spanish conquest, and they turned out to have cinnabar as well that were being used as pigment. And we ran all of these from different parts of Peru, from different time periods. And it turned out that the isotopic signature of Huancavelica was extremely broad, but it was patterned. It's the area that you see here as white, while the other sources were over here. And the artifacts from basically all clustered, or largely clustered, in the area of the Huancavelica signature. So Kunturwasi and Chongoyape and Las Huacas and Cerro Blanco, they all seem to be coming from Huancavelica. That's true for the masks that date to the Middle Horizon, and it's even true for the wooden keros. But much to our surprise, those 3 digging sticks that date to Inca times are notably different. So we basically concluded that we could distinguish between the different Cinnabar deposits using this isotopic technique, we concluded that Huancavelica was by far the most important source. During the Chavín sphere of interaction, we were able to demonstrate that it already began to be used before Chavín times. Interestingly enough, at Gramalote, it's found, it's very scarce and it's mixed with hematite. So they use it in a sense to give a extra spike to the color that you have in red ochre. So it was so valuable, I assume, that they would mix the two together rather than use it alone. And then we were able to show that it continued to be used during the Middle Horizon and the late intermediate period, but that during the Inca Empire, there seems to be the addition of at least one or more additional Cinnabar sources, and that during colonial times, the Cinnabar wasn't only being used as metallic to produce metallic mercury, but it was also being used still to produce vermilion pigment that was used in the Keros. So this is a long tradition. This was an idea that we weren't surprised about because it had been suggested that some colonial paintings in Peru use vermilion as the basis of their oil paints. But in any case, it was interesting that they were still using it from Huancavelica in the Keros. Well, then this still left me with the puzzle of Azogues. And Karen Bruns, who, because of her friendship and her personality, which is extremely persistent, began to write me as I was doing this, saying, "You're barking up the wrong tree. You have to come to Ecuador. You know, if you really want to figure this out, you have to come to Ecuador." So I wrote all my colleagues in Ecuador, and I published a book on Ecuadorian formative, so I knew a fair number of people, asking them if they'd ever seen an artifact that definitely had cinnabar that had been tested chemically. Not isotopically, but at least showing there was mercury in it. And they all said, no, they'd never actually done that. No one had ever published it. I wrote to museums, say, did they have any pieces in the museums that clearly had cinnabar on them? And they all told me, no, we haven't actually, there's not a single piece we can actually demonstrate. Well, when I wrote this to Karen, she told me that when she excavated Pirin Kai, she'd found something that was red, and she'd held it up and lit a match, and it had disappeared. It had vaporized, and that she thought she'd demonstrated, you know, that it was likely there was cinnabar. But in any case, she kept after me, and I said, well, this is worth looking at. But when I looked at the northernmost, I said, well, why don't we look at the northernmost sites that are much closer to Azogues than to Huancavelica, and including these masks. And it turned out they all were from Huancavelica Cinnabar, all of them. But she was trying to convince me. She sent me this picture, for example, and she said, the mines are still, I said, well, when you were there, did you collect any cinnabar? And she said, no, I couldn't find any. She said, but what I think you should do is rent some heavy earth-moving equipment, and you should go yourself and reopen the colonial mine. I said, well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that. And based on my knowledge of Latin American politics, it sounds a little complicated. But she insisted that I should do that. This is, here you can simply see the sites. And they all plot nicely within the Huancavelica signature. Then I met a person called Chris Lane, who teaches at Tulane. And it turned out he was an expert on Ecuadorian mining. And I said to him, well, I don't understand, you know, here's this place called Azogues. My colleague Karen Bruns insists that it could be a major source. Well, what's the story? And he said, oh, this is actually a great case study, because it turns out that there's no evidence at all that Azogues ever produced even 1 ounce of mercury, that it was a giant swindle. It was a hoax. because the Spanish crown was so desperate to find mercury for the amalgamation process that it offered all sorts of labor and tax benefits. And so all you had to do was claim that you're going to mine Cinnabar, and they begin to extend these things to you. And then later in time, it was so valuable that you could get private investors. So that they had come up with this hoax. And the Spanish crown, which got a substantial portion of all the price of Cinnabar when it was mined, kept sending commissions to Ecuador in order to check on this azogues that they'd heard about. And each time they come back with the same answer. Well, we did it, and all there is hematite. In a couple of cases, they actually took samples back to Europe to test them in the laboratories in Spain at Almaden, where you had specialists in Cinnabar, and they came to the same conclusion over and over again. And eventually, Alexander von Humboldt was sent, and he even concluded there's no Cinnabar in azogues, right? But people, and it says every generation would send a thing, and each time they'd be hoaxed. And actually, Karen is just the most recent person who is hoaxed. So I think it's now clear, as this diagram shows, here's Chavín de Huantar over here. And this would be the Cinnabar source. The main obsidian source for Chavín is down here. And actually, it turns out there are a whole series of large public Chavín centers like Atalla that were built near the obsidian source as well. So it seems like the south central highlands of Peru, in part, were developing in relationship to these raw materials that were being sought further north. When I present this, very often the question that I get from the audience, this is a preemptive strike, is, well, why would people want the Cinnabar if it's so toxic? That mercury is so poisonous. And when you go to the early colonial dictionaries or the early accounts of the chroniclers, there's virtually 100% agreement that the purpose of the Cinnabar, of the vermilion pigment, was as face paint. And different chroniclers tell you different occasions on which it was used. It could be used for funerary occasions. It could be used at a time of war. It could be used in certain religious rituals, or women sometimes use small amounts of it in order to appear more attractive. And all of these things appear, and yet archaeologists consistently say, well, it was used when you buried someone, right? Because that's when the archaeologist finds the Cinnabar. It's actually, because Cinnabar, it turns out, is not soluble. So it basically stays with the bones, on the bones, or even stay after the bones disappear, in contrast to the flesh. But when you would use this face paint or body paint on other occasions, you'd finish a ritual and you'd bathe and it would disappear. So that it's basically invisible in the archaeological record. Probably the cases when we see it in a funerary context just represent the sort of thin tip of the wedge for the amount that it was used. And of course, like hallucinogenic drugs, you use it once and it's over, you need more. And the same thing is true, we all know women's cosmetics, right? You're continually having to consume them. And so there's probably a real demand for this. But then people say, but how's this possible if in fact mercury is so toxic? And so I became interested in this. This would, people have different kinds of face painting or body painting with red pigment. In the jungle they use plant dye like achiote. You can use ground up ochre, but obviously Cinnabar would be a much stronger vermilion color. So the question is, if if the ancient Peruvians were using all of this cinnabar or this vermilion pigment as body paint, were we looking at a group of wild people who, like the Mad Hatter, who consumed a little bit too much mercury? They were simply poisoning themselves. And so when I began to look into this, I called in actually an old friend from college, and he was close friends with the head pathologist of Chicago who specializes in poisons. And so I said, well, what's the story with cinnabar? And he said, well, actually, the truth is that cinnabar is not very poisonous. It's not very toxic at all. And the reason it's not toxic is because it's not soluble, that the body can't absorb it because it doesn't dissolve in the sweat, and therefore it's actually not, it doesn't go into the body. And when it goes into the body, it's usually through the mouth. It would have gone in through the mouth, but the stomach linings have all sorts of defenses against the cinnabar, so that very little is actually enters the bloodstream or is metabolized. And it turns out that there's a lot of work that's been done on this subject, because there's 70 different medicines that are folk medicines in China that use cinnabar. And they're ground up and mixed with other herbs and other items. And some of these are imported into the United States and sold in shops as remedies. And they don't fall, under the purview of the FAA or whatever, Food and Drugs Administration, FDA. And so various scientists who are interested in this have taken this up to study. Obviously, it's not good for you to ingest mercuric sulfide. It's not good. But it turns out that its effect on you is really over your lifetime, that you absorb small amounts, and it begins to accumulate in the body. And maybe, later in life, it can begin to lead to, certain kinds of things like renal failure or something like that. But it would be very hard to relate the actual consumption or use of the cinnabar with the disease, because it would occur long after the actual use. So there's really no reason. I mean, many things aren't good for you, including, cream cheese and, cheesecake. They're all of us have our vices, but still. So I think the notion that cinnabar somehow could not have been used in antiquity on a widespread basis as part of their cultural system, it really reflects our own bias because of our fear of mercury. Metallic mercury, it turns out, this kind of things we played with as kids back in the old days, is 1,000 times more toxic than cinnabar, 1,000 times. All right, well, that's all I have to say. Thank you.